Hello, my name is Madeline Carlson, and today I'm going to be talking about Proverbs 27 and how it can provide comfort to the Israelites while they were exiled from the Promised Land and also to our pandemic world today. So, some context about the exile. This is accounted for in 2 Kings 24 through 25, and basically the exile was a result of God being angry at the Israelites for just breaking the covenant and just repeated sin, worshiping false gods, and so on. And it took him centuries to actually go through with his exile. As we know, God is very patient. And so he was putting up with it and tolerating the sin for some time, but eventually he had enough. And so as a result of that, he caused the Babylonians to come in and invade and exile the Israelites. So, as we know, the exile was a very traumatic experience for the Israelites. The Babylon decided to lay their city under siege and cut off their trade routes and basically starved the Israelites out. And once they were famished enough, they broke down the city walls, came in, killed a lot of innocent people, burned the temple and a lot of other buildings, and then sent the survivors out into exile. And although the Israelites were warned by several prophets to stop rejecting and breaking the covenant, of course, as you know, is a common pattern in the Old Testament, they did not listen, and as a result, Babylon came in and took them into exile. And then some context about the pandemic, although I'm pretty sure we all know it fairly well. On January 9th of 2020, the World Health Organization announced a coronavirus-related pneumonia in Wuhan, China. And on January 21st, the CDC confirmed its first United States coronavirus case. And on February 3rd, the United States declares a public health emergency. And on March 11th, the World Health Organization declares the coronavirus as a pandemic. And then March 19th, California issues a statewide stay-at-home order. And from that point on, I'm sure we all know what happens as we are still living and experiencing the pandemic world today. So the wisdom books are 5 books in the Old Testament, which are Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. And they were all written or collected at very different times, which implies that there was likely multiple authors to them, and they were written at different times, meaning that they're not necessarily chronological, but more so just put together for organizational purposes. And in our Oxford Annotated Bible, the author describes wisdom literature as works that share reflection on universal human concerns, especially the understanding of individual experiences and the maintenance of ordered relationships. So in other words, the wisdom books touch a lot on emotions, both negative and positive ones, and how a person can handle each kind of emotion. So each book within the wisdom book category provides different types of wisdom and advice for different kinds of situations or events that are going on. So it's important to read them all to gain the widest perspective possible of the wisdom books. So Job is a single narrative about suffering, as Job was learning to handle the hardships that were given to him. And then the Psalms are more of a way to express and handle emotions in community. And then Proverbs, we'll touch more on the next slide. Ecclesiastes, it focuses on different chapters and events in people's lives, so one might not always find them relatable or applicable to their current situation, and that's okay. But they just teach us to enjoy the present, although there is a lack of hope, and also it touches on how to handle the harder trials of life. And then finally, Song of Solomon is about being in love, although I'm not going to touch too much on that today. So going into Proverbs, it was attributed to be written by King Solomon, but there were likely other authors involved as well. And the Proverbs don't need to be read in order from chapter 1 to the end of the book, because they're not chronological or anything. And the Proverbs are about wisdom coming from and being for the communities in which people live. So it's more about for a broader audience rather than an individual. And it aligns with Deuteronomistic theology, meaning that if you follow the covenant, you'll be blessed, but if you break it, you'll be cursed. And basically, it's just a tangible rule book with concrete and broad pieces of wisdom and advice that can be applied to almost everyone in any situation. So going more in depth to Proverbs 27, the key verses I really liked from this chapter are verse 2, verses 5 and 6, and verse 17. So verse 2 says, "Let another praise you and not your own mouth, a stranger and not your own lips." And I like this verse because basically it's just saying, be humble, don't brag about things, and just, yeah. And then verses 5 through 6 says, "Open rebuke is better than love, carefully concealed. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." And I like this verse a lot too because it's basically saying true friends are going to be upfront and honest and call you out when they need to. And fake friends won't do that. They'll just constantly be on your side and will never be the role of the bad guy because they don't actually have your best interests in mind. And so I think it's just important to know this when meeting new people and like in relationships in general, because it's important to hold one another accountable. Because when we really care about a person, we want them to succeed and do well. And if that means calling them out on certain things, then that's what you have to do. And then finally, verse 17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." And I like this verse a lot because it's basically saying we influence one another, whether that's in a negative or positive light. So if one person is breaking the rules and the covenant, that can have an effect on another person. But if one person is following the covenant or rules, then that can also impact another to do the same as well. So it's basically just like we as humans just influence one another and we kind of go off of what we are doing. So interpreting Proverbs 27 from the Israelites' perspective. So as I talked about earlier, the exile is likely the result of the Israelites not keeping their covenant with God. And more specifically, as verse 5 said, they weren't holding each other accountable to the sins they were committing, but more so, as what is said in verse 17, they were feeling off of each other's sins. So how I see it is that one person might have begun worshiping gods, and as others observed that they weren't being punished and they're getting away with it, they thought maybe they could do the same thing and not be punished as well. And so this whole ripple effect happened, and more Israelites were just falling away from God and going into sinful life because that's what their neighbors were doing and no one was telling them that it was wrong. And although the exile was a very, very traumatic and violent part of Israel's history, it was likely deserved just as a result of God needing to intervene and put his foot down and just say, I've had enough with your sins. You guys need to come back to me and follow out the plan I have for you. So I think the message from God that can be taken from the exile would be just some more Deuteronomistic theology, meaning follow the covenant and you'll be blessed, break the covenant and you'll be cursed. So I think he just offers guidance to the Israelites here, saying, you did wrong and I'm punishing you, but I'm also going to lead you back to the promised land eventually. So there is just also like a glimpse of hope in it too, as the Israelites should know that God is not going to fully abandon them, but rather he is just rerouting their their priorities and changing their lifestyle. And then connecting Proverbs 27 to the pandemic, I also think the pandemic could be a result of us not being faithful to God. And although we're not necessarily building physical altars and high places for false gods, I believe we do have idols in our lives today. The first few that come to my mind would be social media and money. So I think that has a lot to do with it, that we're not only being faithful to God anymore. And additionally, we also are listening to our neighbors more than God. As kind of going back to the idols thing, I mean, most of our friends have social media. A lot of adults we know in our lives are invested in stocks, and we see that those are big priorities in their lives and can oftentimes take over the actual important things, such as God. And then we're also not holding each other accountable when we should be, because if we're seeing these people focusing more on money and social media and their appearances more than worshiping and praising God, and we're not saying anything, that's on us, and that's us not being as faithful and good to God as we should be. So I think the pandemic is God forcing us to reground ourselves and fix our priorities, because humans are just naturally very social creatures, but with the stay-at-home orders and everything, it forced us to take those social aspects away and required us to be alone and with ourselves and just think about our lives a lot more. And personally, I realized I had a lot of my priorities wrong before, and it kind of gave me a lot of time to reflect and just reprioritize our things. And I began putting God first a lot more than I was before the pandemic. And I think a lot of people can relate to that as well. And like with the exile with the Israelites, the pandemic is harsh but likely deserved, just as we have fallen so far from a faithful and God-oriented life that he just needed to set us back on the right track again. So I think God's message here would be to rethink our priorities, and he offers just guidance and hope. Again, like with the exile, he's guiding us to a better life that is for him, and also offering us the hope that he's still with us and that he has not abandoned us. So I think there's also a lot of comfort that can be found in Proverbs 27. It offers advice for the future, like how to live better in community with one another. More specifically, how to hold one another accountable and also set good examples, because as we learned from Proverbs 27, we influence one another way more than we may realize. And if we're not setting good examples or calling one another out when we are in the wrong, that can be detrimental to our culture and community, as we see in both the exile and the pandemic. And I think Proverbs 27 also influence us to choose to follow the way of wisdom, as there's a whole section of the Bible that is dedicated to wisdom. So not just Proverbs, but also the other wisdom books in general are great resources to refer to when we feel that we're being led astray or just feeling any emotion at all. We can turn to them for advice on almost any situation in life and can gain comfort in knowing that there's just somewhere we can reference and find solace in and know that we're not alone no matter what. And I think that's something that the Israelites realized during their exile and something that we can know in our pandemic world today. And that is my final project on Proverbs 27 and the interpretation through the exile and the pandemic. Thank you so much for listening.